About a year ago, I started talking about whether open source was going to fail, because clearly we've won. 96% of all software stacks are dependent on open source. 76% of that software is open source, according to Sonatype's report last year. And the question isn't whether we've won. The question is, what have we won? Have we won the war or a battle? Open source is under pressure. There is a lot of friction. And across the next two panels, and I'm going to apologize, nobody got the slides wrong, it was me. So we should have had Bruce after the first panel. So everybody running around me is rejigging my mistake, so bear with us. The first panel is going to look at the external pressures coming in on open source. And the second panel is going to look at the internal friction within our communities. So it's a pleasure to welcome to the stage the first three panelists. Dr. Allan Friedman, who's a senior advisor and strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the US, CISA or CISA, I'm never sure which way to pronounce it. Sarah Novotny, Director of Open Source Strategy in the Azure Office of CTO at Microsoft, and Mike McQuaid, who's the project leader and maintainer of Homebrew and the CTO and co-founder of Workbrew. Now you may be thinking, why is she playing that? We've got the theme, the music's British. Why would she be playing Tom Jones' Sex Bomb? So since the term S-bomb was coined, that song has been in my head and now it's in yours. Well, so as I said, open source, we've won. External frictions, regulation, policy, security, supply chain, and being a maintainer. Being a maintainer, external, we'll get to it. Allan, you work in policy and regulatory, you work with the US government department. Tell me, why are government departments across the globe suddenly looking at open source?
Well, as we've already established, sort of open source won. Right? We took over the software world, and software runs every aspect of our lives. So I come from the security world, and in security, when we talk about saving lives, it's important. And you get to sit up a little straighter, your voice drops a couple octaves, and you get a couple extra zeros at the end of your budget. So CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. We focus on responding to threats. We're a civilian agency, responding to threats to the American government and the American population, and building out how we're going to respond and be resilient to future threats. And so a lot of this is saying, if the software that we're worrying about is not just proprietary, if it's open source, we need to understand what are the risks, not just at the technical level, but at the very core human level of how do we make sure that our trains run, that our water gets delivered, that lives are safe.
So, Sarah, when you look at that from the context of a major company, how are you managing the interactions with these policies, with these regulations that folks like Allan are starting to bring into open source?
The answer is we're learning. We're always learning in this space, particularly because some of the regulations aren't even fully formed at this point. Recently, there was the CRA in Europe, and it speaks to compliance to standards. Oh, by the way, we're going to figure those standards out. So that's all still coming. So the answer here is, just like open source, just like good developer conferences, it's all just-in-time delivery at the moment. We're working in the US, particularly against an executive order from the US government also, saying that we need to secure our supply chains in a meaningful way. All of this leads to the point that software, and open source specifically, have won. We run the world in this way. And without understanding, I love the way you framed it as risk. I gave a talk to a bunch of investment bankers at one point who are like, how do we evaluate companies? And I said, ask them about their open source dependencies. They're like, but they're proprietary software. And I'm like, ask them about their open source dependencies. Do they know how many dependencies do they have? Do they know where they are? Do they know which are their critical risk points? Which are the ones that have existing CVEs against them? Are they able to articulate whether the software they have or are using is even actually a risk if it has an open CVE? This is the VEX work that's happening in a number of places, trying to find a way that businesses can rationalize the software that they develop, because Lord knows, when was the last time any of you wrote a math library? It's been a while. So we need to rationalize and understand as companies where we're using open source software. Not many companies can actually give you a good articulate answer in this. The larger companies, I feel, are doing a better job, and that's still trying to get our arms around an amoeba. So we're trying very hard and continuing to learn the whole way that we're doing this. But that means we work with you in the communities, in open source, in standards, in government, to figure out how we can make sure that our software is safe and secure, well documented, and engages with our users in a way that they can understand.
So, Sarah, if that's a lot of work for a company of the scale of Microsoft, obviously you have a lot of utilization, but if that's a lot of work for you, it begs the question, how does a maintainer cope with the policy and the regulation that is being imposed upon them, whether it's in the White House executive orders, the European Cyber Resilience Act, which Sarah just mentioned, with a potential of 44 standards being put in place to allow it to work. Mike, how are you going to cope with that?
Well, one of the nice things is, because I'm a maintainer who does not live in the United States or, unfortunately, the EU, thankfully, as long as I'm happy to just not travel to those places, I don't have to worry too much. But more seriously, I think there is this underlying tension we have right now where there's a lot of regulations that are in place that make sense, that don't really affect me too much. Software patents is the one that comes closest to being like an actual day-to-day annoyance. But in the longer term, we see a need for kind of regulation around software and AI, and when I put my kind of citizen paying attention to politics hat on, it's very easy to see why there's a move to do these things. But I think where we need to be really careful is people understate in open source how much of the work is just done by volunteers in their evenings and weekends. So Homebrew, the project I work on, I think most people who are doing development on a Mac are likely to interact with Homebrew in some way or form. We kind of, our estimates based on our analytics, so we've got about 30 million users. We've had...
How many users?
About 30 million.
30 million.
Yeah. So this is all done. We have about 10,000 people who have contributed over the years, but only 30 people are kind of actually making sure that Homebrew is running. And none of those people, I guess, except maybe me now that I've started my own business doing some of this stuff, none of those people are actually paid a day job salary to do that. So what happens if we make this work for those people dramatically harder through regulations? What happens if we put people in a situation where they're worried about legal risk here? There's a real chance of having a chilling effect where people are going to say, well, why would I spend my evenings and weekends working on stuff that's used and relied upon by many, many people, where I'm not getting paid or getting tiny amounts of money for this as like a sort of donation, if someone's going to turn around and sue me for doing that? So I think we need to be really careful when we're doing this stuff. Bruce had some great points, I thought, in the talk earlier about we need to think carefully about what we're going to do with the big players, the Googles, the Microsofts, the whoever, who have big budgets, who have the money to be able to comply with regulations, and what are we going to do with the small players? What are we going to do with the people who sit down in their house in their evening and decide to make an open source library that then many millions of people may rely on in 5 or 10 years? Because we don't want those people to decide, this is too risky, I'm going to go play World of Warcraft instead.
Yeah, and this is a really important conversation because I spoke to a lord, as you do, I spoke to a lord recently about liability and risk. And he was surprised when I expressed the view as a lawyer of 25 years who spent the last 15 in open source, that we know that regulation applies to open source software in our community. Nobody's surprised by that. Regulation trumps licensing. And what we need is regulation that's agile, that's flexible, and that recognizes the kind of people who are maintainers and building these projects and building that best innovation for the rest of the world. So, Mike, just to finish that conversation, maintainers, something it took me a long time to work out. The maintainer responsibility doesn't flow with your employer, right? It flows with the individual.
No, I mean, a lot of the time, maintainers, as I mentioned, they're doing this stuff in their evenings and weekends. We have an increasing number of maintainers, which is a good thing, who are doing that 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, being paid by their employer to maintain an open source project. So those folks have obligations to their employer. Generally, most companies are not happy to just pay you for no reason whatsoever. If you find one, let me know, because that'd be great. But most of these maintainers who are doing it in their spare time, essentially they don't really have any obligations to the community that they work on. And if you look at most open source licenses, they kind of state this pretty clearly, where essentially, I wrote a blog post about this a few years ago, that maintainers liked the title, pretty much everyone else hated it, called Open Source Maintainers Owe You Nothing. Because if you read through an open source license, it effectively says that there's no guarantee this software will work. There's no guarantee this software will even do the things that we say it will. And even if this software were to break on purpose and cause you damage, you agree in using the software that you do not hold the maintainer liable in any form. As Amanda said, when that kind of comes to regulatory frameworks, there's a bit more of a blurred line there. I think if I deliberately made Homebrew do something in a way that was negatively impactful on people, I suspect there would be legal implications involved there, even if the license says otherwise. But I think it is important to note that the bulk of people who are doing this stuff, even if they do it in some of their working hours, if they're putting it out in their own name, if the copyright is held by them, then it's up to them and their relationship with the open source community to manage, and not something that their employer can or does do for them.
And what the licenses generally say is that you exclude liability, and some of them say to the fullest extent permitted by law, because the law trumps the license, and that's the way that the world of regulation works. Now, I know both Sarah and Allan are desperate to jump in on that. I'm going to let Allan go first, because we've waited longest to hear more from him.
You know, one of the big challenges is how can policymakers understand the developer perspective, the maintainer perspective. And I think there are a couple of lessons that we can take from the past. So again, I come to the security world, and in the bad old days, there was a constant fight between security researchers who would point out that security was terrible, and the people who sold commercial software, who used the government to try to throw those people in jail. And what's pretty incredible is in the last 10 or 15 years, we've solved that problem. Last couple years at the famous DEF CON hacker conference, governments from all over the world have gone there to listen, to learn, and to demonstrate. We get hackers. They're the immune system of the internet. And so there are ways that we can build that kind of collaboration. But it's sort of still there, and there's the as-is model. There's a great blog post by a French developer last year, Thomas Depierre, who said, it was titled, "I am not your supply chain." And it really should have had an expletive in it. I am not your supply chain. And I get it, and totally makes sense. But there's also a pretty amazing project called Zephyr, which is a real-time operating system, open source, and the vision is that that should underpin some of our most important systems in the world. And if we want that to be in that environment, and we want it to be that important, then that community is going to have to continue the great work they're doing of making sure that there's maintenance, that there's updates, that they can respond, and I'll also point out, also respond negatively, to be able to communicate downstream, hey, this doesn't affect us, carry on. All of those things are what downstream users of open source need.
Sarah.
I wanted to touch on maintainers and how they intersect with corporations, because that is an open problem today. Because how many demand letters have you gotten recently from companies going, I need your SBOM now, and it's like, well, I don't know you that.
Yeah, we get a few of those. I'm quite good at saying no in all areas of my life.
So we corporations errantly misunderstanding the license, misunderstanding the social contracts of open source, send demand letters. We say we want someone to contribute to open source, so we hire an open source developer, but then our business choices change, and the hiring that person to work on open source is only as durable as the manager or maybe the VP who said, yes, you can use half your time, yes, you can work all your time on open source. So we need things like different ways of conceiving about maintainer roles in corporations, because being a maintainer on a critical system, OpenSSL was a great example in Bruce's talk. If we have a critical dependency, if our customers have critical dependencies on this, there is good reason for us to hire a maintainer, to allow that maintainer to continue to work on this. And this is an uphill battle in every company I've worked in. We have maintainers who want to work, and yet they want to work on open source. And we have social contracts within open source. So to your point, maintainers, even if they are hired by a corporation, will maybe get their job shifted slightly, and then because they're personally responsible to the open source community through a social contract, through a group that is larger than their company, they end up working on their evenings and weekends because maybe we didn't get as far during my day job, or maybe my work has changed. So we're still burning out open source maintainers even when we pay them to work within our larger corporations. This is an open problem, and no company can currently rationalize as well about the social contract as an individual inside open source as in competition with the corporate contract of my employment.
I think that social contract conversation is a really important one, and we're going to delve into that a bit more in the next panel when we talk about the internal frictions. Mm-hmm. We've got about 5 minutes left in this panel, and we really want to try and open this conversation up. Now, I told you we were convening the global open tech community here because there were big discussions to be had, big challenges to face. I didn't say we had the answers. So we are working on these answers. We want to convene the conversation, and we want to continue the conversation. So we will continue the conversation after this morning, after today. And any of you who want to engage on an ongoing basis should be in touch with us, and we will bring you together. But before we wrap this external factor panel, we can take one, possibly two questions if the panelists are quick in answering. Does anybody have a question for the panel? Gentleman here, and then gentleman here. Assuming we can get two.
Hi, Amanda. I have a question. I'm actually quite worried that even Homebrew is not like small people working for free. So as individual contributors and community members, how can we change that? How can we support you? We are not those big companies, although we work at some of them. So what can we do? The only thing I can think of is championing this stuff inside of the companies, recommending them to sponsor you. But that's as much as I think about it.
Thank you. So as individuals, what can we do? Mike, probably should come to you with that first.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's, well, the first thing you've done already is demonstrating that you care and saying nice things. And you'd be surprised how few people in open source say nice things. Yeah. So don't open an issue, whatever, but if you see someone today who you happen to know works on an open source project you like, tell them, hey, I like this thing, thank you for doing it. You would be surprised how much that helps motivate people. So that's a good start, and it's free, which is even better. Another is just setting your expectations accordingly. Sarah had some really good points with kind of corporations that come along kind of making demands. And I think there's a spectrum here. There's where, you know, you may not be a corporation coming along and demanding SOC 2 compliance for an open source project, but you might be someone who is pretty grumpy that they've hit this bug, and you know, you're feeling angry and triggered or whatever when you write your issue report and you start talking about how this open source project is a piece of bleep and the code quality is a piece of bleep and blah, 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 blah. Don't do that. Try and remember that you're speaking mainly with people who are, as I say, often working in their evenings and weekends for fun, trying to build this stuff for you. just try and be nice, try and be friendly, try and be helpful, do as much as you can to help yourself before you rely on other people to help you. And if you do that, then open source will all be better, and it will be easier for people who are doing this stuff in their evenings and weekends to want to do it more.
Allan, as somebody who's here representing a government department, we don't want to alarm you with the evening and weekend thing, right? We want you to understand that there's millions and billions of dollars going into the ecosystem, perhaps not all being channeled in the right direction, and that's something we need to work on. Comment from that perspective.
Sure. So you may not know this, but from a policymaker perspective, you're actually quite exotic. There's very little that makes it easier and better for me to do my job in Washington than to be able to begin a speech by saying, well, I spoke to a developer in London, and they said, here's a cool story. So if this is something that you've thought about and you're passionate about, being able to think about your own narrative and communicate it in a way that someone else who doesn't know your world can understand why it's interesting and important is very powerful. So that's one of those human sides of things that policymakers and politicians like, is to be able to say, Sue over here is worried about X. So I think that's one of the key things you as an individual can do, and folks like OpenUK can help aggregate that and have those narratives percolate up.
And I would remind you of what I said to you earlier, that we have the Home Office and the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology's AI teams who want to learn more about open source. And they will be in the AI policy zone, right in the basement at the very back, from 1 till 2 and 2 till 3, both days. There's room for 40 people in the consultation room, and they want to understand from you what open source is, how it works, and how the whole AI scene is being impacted. So I'm going to jump to the last question and take that to Sarah, and then we're going to wrap this panel. Gentleman at the front. Mike, please. Down here. That's okay. Thanks, Andy.
Hi, Sami Atabani. Can you hear me?
Can you hear?
Yep.
Sami Atabani. A question, actually, regulations across different jurisdictions, which are very often very conflicting. What can we do to help? I know Amanda mentioned the AI and government officials being around, but it's really difficult to get alignment across the different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I don't know if everybody heard that, and we're going to come to Sarah and Allan very quickly to wrap this up. With differing laws and differing standards across the globe, what can we do to make this simpler? Sarah, thoughts?
This is something where we have a unique opportunity right now, because as a community, we are seeing regulators ask us for our opinions on laws. We are seeing regulators come to us and look for engagement about how to rationalize these things. And generally, governments are fairly good across the globe, not great, fairly good, at rationalizing and trying not to make conflicting laws. But our opportunity today is to participate in this work, to make sure that these standards in the standard orgs that we know about, and generally, as Allan said, speak your piece. The internet is there for democratization of sharing information. So write up what you think, share it with your legislators, share it with the bodies that are convening discussions about what these standards should be, and please participate. That's the best thing we can do right now.
Thank you. Allan?
Very briefly, one thing that can help is security is a giant, complex, multidimensional idea. And so one thing is take your area, right? Whatever it is, if it's memory safety, if it's web app security, take a pick and say, hey, here's a small thing. And then if we can package it in a way that we can then share it with, folks in Brussels, folks in London, folks in Washington, folks in Tokyo and Seoul, then that can be sort of fit into each national orientation, but we can have those common security features.
Yep. Mike, I wasn't going to let you have the last word, but I will.
Cross-border regulation, I don't know. This is not something I think about a huge amount, but I guess, again, I would say just to anyone here who's involved with writing those regulations, consider the little guy who may be impacted by this stuff, and try to collaborate as the open source community has collaborated around the world. You know, our team on Homebrew, we just met together yesterday. We have people who it's their first time leaving their home country, and the first time they've done that has been to come and meet the other people they've been working on with open source for a while. Like, borders don't mean a whole lot to us in open source land, which is why sometimes the regulations and the differences between borders are confusing. Try and copy us a little bit more. Try and work together across companies, governments, countries, etc. And then we can have something a little bit more unified, and we can all be happier and friendlier.
Mike, Sarah, Allan, thank you so much for joining us this morning.